Hello, this is Jabra Ganem again with more from Genesis and the story of Lot today in chapter 19. So, in the previous segment, I spoke a little bit about Lot. I'm not going to continue being negative about him. I'll try to be a little bit more generous when I discuss Lot. But it's hard to do so because 19 gives us a very detailed portrait of the kind of person he was when you give that careful reading. But let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah again, because I want to summarize what I talked about earlier about their sins. And, in the popular imagination, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was homosexuality, and they were destroyed because of sexual sins. This, at least by the account of Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 to 50, this is not the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, as the scriptures explain them with clarity, was pride, that they had fullness of bread. And that is not a negative thing, to have fullness of bread, to have all your material needs satisfied. But when you put it in the context of careless ease, which is a very interesting phrase, neglected the poor and the needy, and the people were haughty. And so all of these things combine together to form a very bad society. Now, we know from the Book of Mormon that this is basically what causes the destruction of nations. I mean, on Ezekiel's on top of the list is the sin of pride. So pride, fullness of bread, careless ease, and neglected the poor and needy, and they were haughty. And in the story, as now I talk about the story of Lot and the two angels, I want you to keep those points in mind about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, because those characteristics become apparent in their behavior. So now we have this story, not as a contrast, but sort of as a symmetry with the story in chapter 18. The angels visit Abraham. Abraham does this amazing job being a host, and he does everything that a Bedouin, that a Haviru who lives in the desert, does to their guests. So now Abraham was sitting in front of his tent, in his household, where he should be. Whereas Lot, when the two angels approach Sodom, he's sitting at the gate of the city. Now, that is a very significant detail, because in the ancient world, the gate of the city was a happening place. It's where strangers registered, it's where festivals started, it's where dignitaries and guests arrived, it's where business transactions happened, and lots of material things, festivals to the city gods happened, sacrifices to the city gods happened. I mean, there is a host of activities. So Lot sitting there is an indication of his status in the city, um, as a man of business, as a man of politics, maybe. But still, when he sees the two angels, he recognizes who they are, and he kneels before them, and he begs them to come in and take advantage of his hospitality. And but the angels do something that is the custom of those cultures. So in the Middle East, even to this day, so you go to someone's house, you stay for a long time, dinner time or lunchtime approaches, and of course they say, have lunch with us or have dinner with us. And you're supposed to say, no, I'm leaving, even if you don't mean it. And usually people don't mean it if you go and you stay until lunchtime. So, but etiquette and manners force you, you're taught that to say no, and you say no several times. In Iran, actually, which is, within those cultures, you're supposed to say no 3 or 4 times before you say yes. It's just good manners. So the angels do that, but then finally they do that. They go to Lot's home. But then here is the controversial story, and this is probably where the whole story of homosexuality starts in popular imagination, even though in the text the evidence for it is not that strong. It can be implied, but it's not. And it's all in verse 5 where it's in that verb to know. And to know, I mean, in this, in biblical literature, to know can mean to have sexual intercourse with someone. But you have to also keep in mind the political situation at the time, which we've read about. There was a big battle. Lot was taken a prisoner. There are these kings fighting for turf. I mean, the whole area is in turmoil. Not to mention that there's always the famine in the background. So many interpreters, many people who read the story, including Jewish fathers, say that there is a possibility that this was not about getting the men out, asking for the men to come out to have sexual intercourse with them, but it was rather about getting them out to interrogate them and to see if they are coming into the city to do no good. Now, we know that the people of Sodom are no good. And as I said in the previous segment, hospitality to strangers in those cultures, you don't ask people where they're coming from, who they are, what their purposes are for 3 days usually. So this is unusual that they are coming in and asking, and for them to come out to be interrogated or insulted or attacked or assaulted. We don't really know for sure. But Lot reminds them. Lot says, "Why do this?" They don't. In verse 8, he says, "Don't do anything to them. They've come under my house, under my roof," which means they are under my protection. So there is that whole cultural thing going on here, I think. And then someone might look at verse 8 and says, "Well, here is Lot offering his girls, his 2 daughters, and again." uh, Sexual intercourse is implied, but it's not stated, and even the verb to know isn't used here. So again, other interpreters looked at this and they said, that Lot was speaking rhetorically here and saying, you taking these people and doing and insulting them or assaulting them is as bad as you taking my daughters to assault them and insult them. Now, in verse 9 is a line that I always stop at, because remember, Lot chose to pitch his tent towards Sodom. He chose to be a part of this community, and he chose to be in this corrupt environment. And remember, he chose to be there, chose the land, chose the area. He was taken prisoner by the kings. Abraham saved him. And in perspective, I look at that situation. If that happened to me, I'd leave town. But he chose to stay in that area, knowing how bad it is. But the people of the city do not consider him as one of them. And they basically say, here is this resident alien, let's say, and he is telling us what to do. He wants to be our ruler. Now remember, in the beginning of this chapter, he's sitting at the gate of the city with all the nobility. And so this is a moment of disillusionment. I thought I was a citizen of good standing in this town, but these people don't consider me to be one of them. And this is a situation that arises in the modern world with the rise of nationalism. The rise of nationalism, you might, in a nationalistic society, you might consider yourself, if you're someone who's immigrated there or and even acquired citizenship of a country, uh, nationalists usually don't consider you to be a part of that society. Not all, but for the most part. It's just the nature of nationalist feelings and tendencies. And we see it playing out here in chapter 19 of Genesis. So now there is this struggle at the door, and uh, the angels shut the door, protect the house, and they ask, and the people outside ask Lot to leave the city to with his daughters, with his in-laws. But the in-laws and the daughters who are married, they just look at this and they take it lightly, and they wouldn't do it. And Lot is having second thoughts. In verse 15, the angels are begging him, literally, begging him to leave the city, but he doesn't want to leave. There is all this wealth, all this status, and he's hoping to save it, and he's hoping that this is not going to happen. He's kidding himself. He's telling himself this lie that things will be okay, but it's not. So in verse 16, they give him commandments. So it's a very stern commandment when you read it in the Hebrew. They take him out and they say, save yourself, do not look behind, do not stop, and go to the mountain so that you're not destroyed. So they give him these commandments. And in 18, he's still having, if an angel of the Lord who's about to destroy this my city is telling me to do this, I will do it. Now, I will do it. But Lot is fighting against the pricks. He's fighting against the pricks, and he wants to stay. He doesn't want to go to the mountain. So they're telling him the mountain is safe. Go to the mountain. So he goes to this. He goes to this small village, and the name of the village in the English it says Zoar. In the Hebrew, in Arabic Semitic translations is Sogar, and Sogar means small, insignificant. So here is Lot, the big man, now going to this insignificant little village. But then that will change. Anyway, so then the catastrophe happens. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. There are lots of scientific theories about how this could have happened. And as they are fleeing, running away, the wife, Lot's wife, whose name in Hebrew lore is Edith. It's not mentioned in the Bible, but the Hebrew Jewish fathers said that her name is Edith. And she looks behind and she becomes a pillar of salt. And the question might beg itself here. Why a pillar of salt? Salt was a very valuable commodity in the ancient world. It's a symbol of wealth. Salt trade was big in those times, and all the way to the Roman times, and it was a high value commodity, but it was also used in preserving things. And here is Lot's wife who looked behind, and the indication is she wanted to go back to the city, and because the command. The people in Sogar, for example, weren't destroyed, and I'm sure they could look at the city and see it being destroyed. So why was Lot's wife destroyed? Lot's wife, the implied meaning here is that Lot's wife was preserved as a pillar of salt because she wanted to go back. She turned around to go back. Now, Hebrew fathers, Talmudic fathers, basically say when she looked back, she saw the back of the Lord as he destroyed the city, and she wasn't supposed to look at the Lord, and that's why she was turned into a pillar of salt. But salt is symbolic here. She's preserved for eternity in the land she wanted to stay in this very valuable material. It's as if the Lord says, okay, you wanted the riches, you wanted the bounty of Sodom, you want to stay there rather than listen to me, then here you are. So it's sort of an ironic memorial. And Lot eventually leaves Sogar. He doesn't like this insignificant little town, so he leaves it and he goes to the mountain with his two daughters who were not married. And to them, this is the popular opinion that Lot's daughters looked at the world and they thought it was the end of the world and nobody else is in the world. I'm sure they were familiar with the story of Noah. They thought this is something similar. And so they were worried that they are not going to have posterity. Now, this is a very important cultural point here because for a woman in Near Eastern culture, especially ancient Near Eastern cultures, if you do not have male sons who are basically your social security in your old age at the time, then you are doomed. And at that moment in time, their father is their social security. He is the man with the wealth and the resources, but their mother is dead. Their dad is old. So they want to have posterity so that they can have that security, that material security in the future. So they are totally focused in this time of disaster. And we need to build again. We need to start all over. They've lost everything. These thoughts of material security, future security are in their mind. And so they commit incest with their father. And Lot here is exonerated in the scriptures by saying he was completely intoxicated and he didn't know what happened. So I'm sure he later knew as they bore two sons, Moab and Ammon or Amman, which is a city I lived in Jordan for many years. Now, the names are interesting. Moab is a name that means who is my father, and there is a little thing here, a little question that begs itself. Does that mean that Moab grew up not knowing who his father is? Was this a secret that nobody spoke about in the family? Because incest in those cultures, man and his daughter, as it is in our culture, but probably more horrifically so in Near Eastern ancient cultures, was a huge sin. And so the indication here is probably he didn't know. This is a secret they didn't talk about. And Ammon, it's the interesting thing as I look in the old translation by Rabbi Sadia Gawan. It, Gawan basically says she called him the son of my uncle. Again, Ammon, which means people usually, but in Gawan, the way he interpreted it, he interpreted the name as the son of my uncle, which means maybe that's the story that they had in the family about their origin, those two sons, Moab and Ammon. And there is some speculation that this story is emphasized in Genesis because Moab and Ammon become very, very fierce enemies of Israel, and they and the Israelites have all of this conflict. And so maybe this was a slur against them. So this is the story of Lot, and there is lots of themes in it, and I challenge you to think about it, to think about where you stand, where you choose to pitch what you choose to pitch your tent towards. One thing I noticed, I live in Layton, Utah, and in Kaysville, Utah, and the Layton Temple is being built. And one thing I noticed the other day, I was out for a walk with my wife, is that our house, if you just walk outside and on a clear day, you can see the top of the newly built Layton Temple. And I love that. My tent is pitched towards the temple. And I hope that we all pitch our tent towards houses of God and towards God. And my house also faces our local ward, so my tent is pitched toward the local ward. So that's what I have for you today, and any thoughts, comments would be appreciated if you have them. Thank you.